Good evening, everyone. I'm A.J. Robinson, the chairman of Georgia Forward and the president of Central Atlanta Progress. On behalf of all of our hosts, I want to welcome you to this webinar, Let Your Voices Be Heard. We have a wonderful group of panelists tonight discussing the upcoming election, which is on everybody's mind from all different angles. We've got some great institutions represented, and we hope you sit back and enjoy it. A couple of housekeeping things to go over. Today's program is being recorded, and the link will be shared after the event concludes. All comments are off the record. Participants, your microphones are muted. Just the panelists will be able to talk, but we welcome your comments and questions. If you can find the question tab on the control box on your screen, please ask your question and we'll try to get them in at some point in the program. And again, on behalf of everyone involved in this program, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're participating, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Larry Hanson, who's the executive director of the Georgia Municipal Association, and Larry's going to take it from here.
Thank you, AJ, and good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight for this special session from Georgia Forward and GMA on Let Your Voices Be Heard, how, when, and why to vote. We're very pleased tonight to have a great group of panelists to share information with you. And first, we'll just take a moment to tell you a little bit about GMA. We are the Georgia Municipal Association, where I serve as executive director. GMA exists to serve the 538 cities of Georgia. We provide services in legislative advocacy, education and training, consulting and technical assistance, and member services and programs to every city in Georgia, and we're very proud of that. Tonight, as I said, we're very pleased to be here with you in our new partnership with Georgia Forward and Young Game Changers. Last year, we were able to work with them, and now this program is under the GMA umbrella. We manage 3 nonprofits, and we're very proud to have this relationship with Georgia Forward and with AJ and the great leadership he and the board have provided for many years, and that will continue. So now to introduce our panel to you, we're very pleased to have tonight our Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. He is going to speak with us in a moment about and give a primer on voting in Georgia's 2020 general election. We're also very pleased to have Senator Jason Carter with us, who is going to discuss the Carter Center, why they believe voting is critical, and why every eligible Georgian should exercise their right to vote. And then we'll hear from Professor Andra Gillespie with Emory University to discuss voting in Georgia, electoral and demographic trends. And then we'll also hear tonight, while she's not part of our panel, but from Janice Lee with the Census Bureau, who's going to just mention connecting voting to the census and remind us how important it is in this final countdown with the census. So our first speaker is going to be Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. He has presided over the historic transition to a new statewide voting system, as well as overseeing a primary earlier this year with a record turnout of plus 1.1 million absentee voters and 1.2 million in-person votes. He was elected Secretary of State in 2018. He previously served 2 terms in the Georgia General Assembly, representing Georgia's 50th district from 2015 to 2019. Following his comments, we will hear from Senator Jason Carter. He has chaired the Carter Center's Board of Trustees since 2015. From 2010 to 15, he served as a Georgia State Senator, representing Georgia's 42nd district, and he was the 2014 Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia. Our third speaker will be Professor Andra Gillespie. She is an associate professor of political science and director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University. Her research focuses on race and politics in the United States, especially political leadership of the post-civil rights generation. Following the 3 of them, we'll hear from Janet Lee, who is a partnership specialist with the Census Bureau. And once they all speak, we will come back and ask some questions, and then we'll also open it up for questions that you'll submit in the chat box that we will ask the panelists. So Secretary Raffensperger, the floor is yours, sir, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be very brief with my comments. Back in January, we predicted and made this bold prediction that we'd have 5 million voters come out and vote for this year. And yet we've had this pandemic, and we're now upping the number. We think we'll exceed that. what we're really right now looking at is perhaps 1.5 million voters that will vote absentee, and then 2 million voters with the early vote period of 3 weeks and a Saturday, and then also the day of election, 2 million voters coming through from that 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. time frame on Tuesday, November 3rd. So what our office is really focused on right now is obviously poll worker recruitment. Prior to COVID, the average age of poll workers was 72. So we had a goal of finding 5,000 poll workers. We hit that. We raised it to 10. We hit that. Now we just are nearing our goal of 15,000 onward to 20. And our total goal now is to find 25,000 poll workers, because we now have more precincts. We have 3,100 precincts up from 2,600. We think that will help with line management. But we also then need 3,100 tech workers. That would be one tech worker in every one of those precincts. And that just won't be resources from your county election officials. It could be tech workers from the county, state employees that volunteer to be a tech worker, but also companies. And we're really grateful to see companies that are in the technology sphere and the workers are jumping forward and say, I'd like to volunteer to be a tech worker. So I throw that out to you today. If you'd like to be a poll worker, you can volunteer at securevotega.com. If you'd like to be a tech worker, you can go to that same site and volunteer to be that. Because when everyone shows up to vote, if we all showed up and there weren't any of those tech workers, weren't any of those poll workers, what would we do? And so we are making a big push. We're really encouraging folks to vote absentee or vote early. And the reason we do that is because that's just so much better. The shortest line you'll have, obviously, is at your kitchen table when you vote absentee. The next shortest line will be that first week of early voting, because there's going to be 2 million folks that go through that 15-day period. And so it just means you'll have less voters per day, and that just means you have shorter lines. So that's a big broad brush of what we're looking for. But we've also been working and partnering with many organizations. I just want to give a shout out to all those companies. Many of those companies, such as the Hawks, have opened up their, State Farm Arena for early voting. That's the kind of participation we're seeing from corporations, and we're just really grateful for that. We're also seeing companies like a Coca-Cola and other companies that are, just icons in Georgia coming forward. How can we help? And so if it's face shields, masks, gloves, disinfectant wipes, things like that, and just to help, really the whole election process, and making sure that we have our poll workers trained, and we also have, great turnout, and people are excited about this process. I know everyone's watching this, and we have both sides of the aisle, and we want to make sure that's a good, orderly election this coming fall. So that's my broad brush. I know we'll have lots of questions about it, but, back to you, Larry.
Thank you very much, Secretary. And yes, sir, we will come back with some questions, and we know we need to be respectful of your time. You've got another commitment this evening. So we will now transition to Senator Jason Carter and look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's an honor for me to be here. I appreciate Georgia Ford and Young Game Changers. I know Amir Faroqi and others who participated in the organization and in the programs have benefited a lot from it, and so I'm glad to be here today. Also, I'm glad to hear from Secretary Raffensperger. We have, in this moment, it's so important for everyone to be transparent and to have the sufficient materials and resources that we need. And I appreciated the Secretary of State's call for people to get engaged as poll workers, for people to get engaged in helping to provide supplies and other things like that. This is obviously an unprecedented moment in our democracy. I'm really here tonight to just mention a little bit about the Carter Center's experience with elections and sort of how we see this moment and the purpose really behind voting. The mechanics, as Secretary Raffensperger just mentioned, are complicated. They're onerous. There's a lot that goes into pulling off an election. But we've at the Carter Center observed 110 elections in 39 different countries since 1989. That is a lot of different perspectives on democracy. And we, you'll hear from Andra Gillespie, who, when I first decided to run for the state Senate years ago, she was studying exactly what it is that motivates people to vote. And it's an interesting point, but I'll just share two stories from my experience with elections outside of this country, and then mention a couple things about our election here on a personal note for me. about sort of why I vote and what motivates me, because I think each person really needs to figure out for themselves what it means to participate in a democracy. But when the first election I ever observed was many years ago, 1996. And I did that with the Carter Center, and then was in Liberia after that in 1997. And then I left for the Peace Corps, and I was in South Africa for the election of Nelson Mandela's successor. So Nelson Mandela was the president of South Africa, and I lived in a tiny little village, you would call it, with about 1,100 homes. So it would have been a very tiny member of the GMA family there, Larry. And we had a precinct there at the secondary school that had 1,708 registered voters. And for that second election, after the end of apartheid, of those, all but about 6 people showed up to vote on election day. And it was one of those moments that was so celebratory. I mean, children were bringing their grandparents in wheelbarrows, some of them because their grandparents couldn't walk, to come in and cast their ballot and participate in this democracy. And it was truly a day-long celebration of what it means to be included in a community, what it means to have rights, to be a full-fledged citizen. And I think that, you know, the excitement and the exuberance and the recognition in that moment for that community was one that I'll never forget. And it made me realize in a lot of ways, it's not that we take it for granted in the United States, it's that our elections have become almost sad events where people feel like they're choosing between the lesser of two evils, or they feel like they're not being properly represented, or they're worried really at this moment about whether their vote's going to be counted, about a history of voter suppression, or about allegations of voter fraud or other things like that have really overtaken the fundamental facts that some other countries really experience in a more robust way. And I think if we can take back the way that we understand our democracy to the sort of those fundamental facts, this vote that we each possess is evidence of, at that moment, equality. It's evidence that my voice is exactly the same value as someone else's. It's evidence that I have the ability to determine the future of my community. And it's also evidence that I am a part of that community. And one of the things that means for me is that when that's taken away, when that is abridged, when it is, you know, when there are barriers put up between me and voting, or between another group and voting, then you end up putting barriers up between people to really be full-fledged citizens in their community. And that is why I think the story of our country is a story of sort of making a more perfect union. And I consider those the barriers to voting that existed at the beginning of our country, you know, to be the largest and the most obvious, you know, evidence that we didn't have a real democracy. And of course, you know, as you move forward in the history of our country and provide suffrage for women, suffrage for African Americans, and expand it, you really begin to see that we're building the kind of community that we all want. And so for me, when I walk into the ballot box, what I feel like I'm doing is saying, this is my moment to participate fully in this democracy, to participate fully in this community. And really that right to vote, it's sort of the deed that you hold that proves that you own those rights as a citizen. And to the extent those are taken away, it bothers me, and it truly undermines our ability to create the kind of community that we want. And so we can sort of appeal to the logic that Secretary Raffensperger mentioned there's 3,100 precincts in Georgia. Well, if you think about the fact that Al Gore lost the presidency and George W. Bush won with a margin of 500 votes, that's less than a 1/8 of a vote per precinct. So every 8 precincts, talking about 1 vote. John Kennedy was elected president basically with a margin of 1 vote per precinct. So we can make that logical argument to people and say, listen, your vote matters because literally every single vote counts. But for me, and the way that I think the Carter Center has looked at it, and that we've experienced these elections over time, it's about participating in a community. And the last moment that I'll sort of reflect on, and then I'll let other folks talk and take whatever questions you all have. When we were in Myanmar, a country, this was a few years ago, the Carter Center observed an election in Myanmar. And in that country, it was a very imperfect democracy, even in that election. There had been a military junta, as everybody is familiar with, for many, many years. The dissidents were brutally repressed, and still, even today, there's a huge, serious problems with what is going on in the system in Myanmar. But on the day of the election, while we were there, I remember someone standing in line who had never voted before, and he was in his 70s. And the line that he stood in was 6 hours and 50 minutes. He got there at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I got to see him at about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I said, "Hey, how long have you been in this line?" And he said, "Well, I've been in here 6.5 hours." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry you had to wait so long." And he said, "Oh, sir, I've been waiting so much longer." And it just makes you realize, I think, the way in which our vote and the right to vote is preservative of all the others. It defines our role in our community, and we need to make sure that we're making that we are allowing people to do it, that we're allowing people to do it freely and fairly, and that those barriers and the logistics don't get in the way. And as we've said, the things we take for granted, they're real in this country. But I think that once we get back to the basics of what it is to be a part of this community, then I think that's the way, at least for me, that I understand how it is that voting becomes important as preservative of every other right that we have, and as real evidence that we live in a democracy.
Senator, those are very inspirational comments. That should motivate us all to make sure we go to the polls and exercise that right and that privilege, as well as that responsibility to vote. We'll now hear from Professor Andra Gillespie from Emory University. So, Professor, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. I hope everybody can see and hear me. I will ask for one piece of technical support. I did see sort of an invitation to share my screen, and I was reluctant to do it early just because I didn't want to take from anybody else. So is it okay if I get that invitation again?
Yes, coming right up.
Thank you.
Okay.
Got it. Okay. All right, so I don't know what you can see on my screen.
We do see Georgia Trends in Voting Registration and Turnout with your name and your title.
Okay, then I can't see it, so I might have to wing this a little bit. So I think there's a way. Let me just move some things around so that I can see everything. Okay, maybe not the way that I did it. I think I remembered the order. So I was asked, and I really thank Brenda Belcher for the invitation to talk about some trends that we see happening in the state of Georgia. So when we think about what's happening in Georgia, we are coming into a period that is actually, not unprecedented for us, but it's something that's been new for most of this century. And so we're now at a period where, unlike 20 years ago, races are becoming increasingly competitive. So the margin of even presidential races has been decided for the last few races by margins of less than 10 percentage points. And in the case of 2016, about 5 percentage points. And we have no reason to suspect that the margin, regardless of what the outcome of the election is, will be any different. So, that's definitely something to keep in mind as we're going forward. How we got here is certainly an interesting phenomenon. And what they're basing this on now are polling data. So if we're looking at sort of the overall sort of figures of things, and somebody please help me out because I can't see anything at this point. If we're looking at sort of the poll data, all the polls are within the statistical margins of the era. So you may have seen a poll last week that had President Trump up by 7 points, but that margin was a little over plus or minus 4, which means that Trump would have had to have been in the lead by 8 or 9 points in order for this to actually be statistically meaningful. And so what we can expect is that unless these margins increase, the margins by which one candidate is ahead of the other increase, or the number of people who get polled in the state shrinks and we can start to sort of get some more granularity and get smaller margins of error, we can expect that this race is going to look competitive. It may not look like North Carolina or Florida, but we shouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of activity in the state, if we start to see lots of ads, more than we've seen already in the state. And we've seen multiple places where if we look at trend lines, we see this kind of coming together. So whether we're looking at the real clear average of polls, or we're looking at the weighted average of polls by 538.com, this is something that we would expect to see going forward. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that Georgia is the presidential race isn't the only race that's competitive. So the increased competitiveness that we've seen in the state of Georgia is actually reflective of increased partisan competition in the state and a number of levels. And so if we look at the number of competitive state house races this year, if we look at the competitive Senate race, particularly the second Senate race, which is likely going to go to a runoff, which could actually be really important nationally, depending on what the balance of power looks like after the November races in the Senate, looking at all the other seats that are up. If we are just looking and paying attention at the competitive congressional races that are taking place in North Metro Atlanta, there are lots of reasons up and down the ballot for people to be involved and to care about what's going on. I do want to point out that, one of the reasons for this increased competition is the fact that Georgia's electorate is becoming increasingly diverse. And because of racial polarization and partisan voting behavior, that's making the state more competitive from an electoral standpoint. And so that puts us in a similar category as Texas, for instance, where we're seeing large minority populations which tend to trend Democratic, voting increasingly Democratic in these states that we have known as being ruby red in memory. There are implications for this, and these I also see as opportunities going forward in the future. So for instance, if we were to look at voter registration and break that down by race and gender, and then compare that to voter turnout as a percentage of those who are registered to vote, who actually show up to vote on election day, what we see is that turnout actually isn't exactly the same across race and gender groups. And so in particular, African-American women vote at almost comparable rates to white women and white men. However, we do see drop-offs overall when we look at Hispanic, Latino community, or if we look at Asian Americans, and then in particular, we see gender gaps in turnout rates, where African American women and Latino women in particular are more likely to turn out to vote than their male counterparts. Some of you have probably heard that part of the reason why Black women in particular are more likely to turn out to vote is because more Black men are caught in the criminal justice system, and so therefore, if men have had their voting rights taken away from them and women have had that happen to them at a lesser rate, that they would be more likely to be a part of the electorate, and that's true, but the numbers that I'm showing here reflect turnout of registered voters. So these are people who have not had their voting rights taken away or who have had them restored after felony convictions. And so these differences in turnout rates are something that we should note, and we should be working on trying to make sure that people, regardless of gender, exercise their right to vote and turn out to vote. So what I see here are lots of opportunities for people to be able to exercise their franchise and to be able to turn out to vote. Just this election is important, as every election is important, but just given the state of the world and the policy issues that are at stake and the decisions that are being made right now, people should have a say in choosing who gets to make these decisions. And so it's just really important to make sure that people exercise their right to vote and make sure that they decide who is going to represent them, as opposed to having other people decide for them. There are opportunities for increasing voter turnout and mobilization amongst all communities, but particularly communities of color, where we still see turnout rates lagging those of their white counterparts. And there should be particular attention given to men. The idea of Black women being the saviors of America, if you're democratically inclined, or being the backbone of the Democratic community, is important, but this is supposed to be a shared responsibility. So this isn't something where you put up forward Black women or Latino women, and then you don't tell the men in their community not to exercise their responsibility. This is something that everybody, regardless of gender, should be a part of. So here's some things that I would recommend as we're going forward. I think that this is somewhat redundant for this particular community, but it's important that we take our responsibility seriously and we exercise our right to vote. And then we can turn to our communities and make sure that our friends and family and neighbors, those closest to us, those with whom we have personal relationships, turn out to vote. And then there's a way that we can contribute systemically to the problem. So one of the things that's actually pretty urgent this year is to replace older poll workers who probably shouldn't be working the polls on election day because of the COVID crisis and their higher propensity to catch and become seriously ill with the disease, younger, healthier workers. So if you do have the opportunity to take a day off of work and you can serve as a poll worker, I would highly encourage that you do so and that you sign up pretty quickly. The other thing is that there are other ways that people could be involved, whether it's driving people to the polls to make sure that they could go vote or that they could drop off their absentee ballots at a secure depository location, or for people who have law degrees and can serve as election protection lawyers. This is a great opportunity for you to be able to be a part of the process and to contribute in an extra but meaningful way. So I hope that my slides have kept up with my conversation, because I'm not sure that that happened, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. And just in case, I'll just keep on tapping.
Thank you very much for those comments. And we were unable to see the slides, but you did a really good job of talking us through. So we would like to make sure that you share those with us, where we can share those after the event with those that are on the call tonight. I'm going to come back to Janet Lee with the Census Bureau. As I mentioned earlier, Secretary Raffensperger has to leave us for another engagement. So we want to be respectful of his time, and we have some questions for him. So Secretary, if you could, I had the pleasure of serving on the advisory committee that reviewed the various voting equipment options prior to the state's decision on a vendor and a platform. I saw firsthand how much careful thought and planning went into selecting Georgia's voting process. Can you talk about the voting system so that citizens know their vote will be safe, secure, and counted? And particularly, we've had a couple of questions about security.
Well, the review and looking at a new voting system went back several years. People realized that the old DREs needed to be upgraded. The software hadn't been updated since 2005. And really, I think you'll see nationwide, voters are really clamoring for a verifiable paper ballot. So as we went through that process, and the General Assembly with House Bill 316 authorized the purchase of new voting equipment. So when you show up to vote now, you'll be checked in, very similar to the old process with the DREs. Then you'll go to the ballot marking device and put in your, looks like a credit card. You put that into the machine. You have your touchscreen choices. After you made all your choices and you press that button, now it will be to print a ballot instead of cast a ballot. And what it'll do is print out the ballot, and then you can review all your choices. Who did you want for president? Who did you want for state senator? Who did you want for your county commissioner? Every single race that we have on the board for November will be there for you to review. And then once you verified you made all those right selections, then you put that on the ballot scanner, press that button, and that's when your ballot will be scanned and drops into the ballot box. When you show up on election day, you know that your vote then has been really accurately scanned in, and that's a good thing. So people really had that confidence. And before COVID, we were out doing demonstrations throughout the state, all over the place, all different demographic groups, county fairs, just so people could actually touch, feel, and look at that ballot. And so that is the new ballot system we have in place, and we're very pleased with that. We put it out to bid, and Dominion was the lowest bid per se. They're obviously the lowest on dollars, and then they were number 2 on the qualitative aspect. But when you run those numbers together, they ended up and were awarded that contract. Dominion has been used. Cook County uses them. They have about 8.5 million population. We have 10.5 million in Georgia, and they're obviously used in Colorado and many other states and counties. Georgia is one of the few states that actually has a uniform statewide system. I think that was the right decision. That goes back to when Secretary of State Kathy Cox was Secretary of State, and I believe that was the right decision. And we have continued on with that process. So that'll be the big thing that you'll see from the standpoint if you show up to vote in person. We also we are keeping on, and we have that online portal, and you can request your absentee ballot at securevotega.com. in less than 30 seconds if you want an absentee ballot. And those will be shipped, they'll be mailed out beginning the 16th, which is I guess tomorrow. Absentee ballots will be in the mail. So you'll start seeing those by the 20th at your doorstep. If you want to vote absentee, we are encouraging that. We're encouraging folks to vote in person, particularly with the 15 days plus that weekend of early voting.
Okay, thank you, Secretary. We've had a couple of questions about the chain of command. So I wanted to ask you, can you talk about the chain of command for the paper ballots? And then also describe for us what the process would be of a paper recount.
Well, from the standpoint, we are starting audits for this fall election. And so every county will be auditing elections. And when you have a close election, then you'll actually be auditing more ballots. With the number of ballots cast, then you have to audit more. But when you do the audit, you are not just running those ballots back to the scanner. You're actually going to sit down and look at if Bob is running for one race and Mary is running at that same race, you're actually looking at the human readable portion of the audit. But it's really, at the end of the day, will give voters that confidence. I understand we live in contentious times, and I understand that half the people will be happy, half the people will be sad with the results. But at the end of the day, when you audit a race that was a 51-49, and then you audit it and come back, oh, that's how it was reported in the evening news, and we just did an audit by looking at that human readable form that it was a 51-49, then we all have the confidence in the results. We may not like the result if our person didn't win, but we have confidence that the results were done. And I think that's really important for election integrity.
Yes, sir. We have a question about a voter's assigned polling place. So with the technology that exists today, which would allow every precinct to have an entire county voter registration information available, could you explain why a voter is assigned to a specific polling place rather than having the option to vote anywhere within the county? Many people might find it more convenient to vote near their office, for instance, as opposed to near their home.
I agree. The issue that we have when we have early voting during that period of time, I live in Fulton County. I can vote anywhere in Fulton County. I could vote in the North Fulton. I could go down to the State Farm Arena. I could go down to College Park. I have those options. On the day of election on Tuesday, November 3rd, it is precinct by precinct. And that is something that we would consider changing for future elections. But right now, we have an awful lot on our plate. We have to really get prepared with the restrictions we have with COVID, with new equipment, training new poll workers. It's just something that we couldn't get across that finish line this year. But it is something that other people have said from both parties. So I think it would be a bipartisan consideration for pluses and minuses. And I appreciate that people work throughout the county, and it would be good for many voters. It's just a challenge of getting there this year because of all the other issues we're facing.
Okay, and then you referenced this, but one of our questions was, can you share the measures that are being taken to ensure both voter as well as poll worker safety at voting sites this year as a result of COVID?
Well, we're really pleased that Homeland Security and GEMA, we have 180,000 masks that we've sent out to the 159 counties, 47,000 face shields, 4,700 packages of gloves, 10,000 boxes of disinfectant wipes, and 11,000 gallons of hand sanitizers. So that's gone out to the counties. So when you show up to vote in person, you'll see your poll worker. They will have on gloves, they will have on a mask, and they will have on a plexiglass shield to separate them from you so that there's just that separation. We're also going to be spacing out the voters in the lines. That's why the lines will be longer. They'll be 6 feet on center. And they're also in your room. If you would have had 20 machines before, now there may only be 10, there may only be 12, or maybe 8, depending on that room configuration. That also means that your throughput per hour won't be as high as it was before just because of that. Then after you vote, the machine is wiped down and get it ready for the next voter, which also adds additional time. And that goes back to why we're recommending that you really, if you want to vote in person, we recommend that you vote in person, on the early votes 3 weeks that we have of doing that. I think it'll be a whole lot easier on you as the voter.
Okay, and then you referenced this in your introductory comments, but your office has done a really good job partnering with organizations across the state to recruit poll workers, and we've heard several speakers already mention the importance of that. But can you share a little bit more about that effort, why it's especially important and necessary this year?
I think it's always important. In fact, when Senator Carter was talking about the Carter Center and really people being engaged in their communities, I think when we get engaged in the election process, it's really the community coming together. It's really like the old town square. And I think when people then are volunteering as a poll worker, they're really taking ownership of the process. And I think that's very good. You look at some of the great service organizations we have, like Rotary. They're just great folks that are involved in Rotary. Look what they've done for polio. Look what they've done for clean water throughout the world. You think about Kiwanis, you think about the sorority, all those groups, when they come together, they're really coming together with a positive attitude, with positive solutions. And so when you see our corporations now wanting to volunteer and mentioning that to their employees, many corporations saying, we will, give you a day off with pay if you volunteer to be a poll worker. You have to just salute that from this corporate sponsorship that you're getting, that they want people to not have an excuse not to become a poll worker. And so we're really excited about all these organizations coming together. And I can't say enough good things about it. I'm just really grateful.
Thank you. And we certainly at Georgia Ford and GMA are looking forward and sharing information to help you in that effort. And we do know the importance of it. The final question for you, sir, I know you have to leave, but one of the goals of Georgia Ford is civic engagement and to help build an identity or a loyalty to being a Georgian, which will encourage citizens to be more invested in how our whole state works and grows and overcomes the challenges together. Some states, it seems, have an identity, California or New York. But what is the identity of Georgia to you, and what does it mean to you to be a Georgian?
I think Georgia is an absolutely wonderful state. It's just filled with opportunity. We also we have a rich legacy, and I'm very mindful of that really in the office of Secretary of State when I think about the people that have gone before us really with the international stage of, first of all, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy, but also then Ambassador Andrew Young. So when you step into this office, it's one of the first things we did is reach out to the King Center. And Dr. Bernice King has just been very gracious and kind to our office. We really want to have positive solutions. We recognize that. As I was running, I read a book, and it was really about President Jimmy Carter, about his first election, and he had to go to court to make sure that the results, the true results, were upheld. Someone was trying to steal the election from him. And I in addition, obviously, to the Camp David Accords, but President Carter, I believe that's what has motivated him for election integrity, not just for America, but for the entire world. And so you come to this office in awe and reverence for the people that have gone forward, and also understanding the legacy of that. And it's that Georgia's moving forward, and we've had great political leadership. I think we have great business leadership. I think the Metro Atlantic Chamber, the Georgia Chamber, have done a great job of really having a common vision, a positive purpose, that we elevate everyone's well-being, our standard of living. And that's just positive, and people should feel very hopeful about our continued forward progress in Georgia.
Thank you, Secretary, and we appreciate you joining us tonight and certainly wish you and your office all the success with these upcoming elections. So thank you for your time tonight. We are now going to transition to Janet Lee with the Census Bureau. Janet is a partnership specialist. She's been working hard on this census. The census is critical to our present as well as our future. It will have an effect on our next 10 years. And so Georgia right now is not where we need to be as far as having a complete count. So Janet, we'd like to hear from you now and explain to us the importance of it and what we all can do as Georgians here in these final days to ensure we get a full and complete count.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, GMA and Georgia Ford, for having this very important webinar this evening. Many people wonder what the relationship is between voting and the census. Simply stated, the census is the precursor to voting. There are two reasons why we conduct the census: power and money. And this evening, we've been discussing the former, voting, which translates into power. The 2020 census determines congressional district maps based on each state's population count. Every 10 years, those congressional seats move around based on population, the number of representatives allocated, which is 435, and a method of calculation. A second major use is redistricting for state legislative districts. I want to convey a very, very, very urgent message and call to action. We need all Georgians to be counted. Right now, Georgia's house is on fire. As you stated earlier, Larry, we are not doing well. We are ranked 46 out of 50 states in regards to the census response. That is not good. We stand a chance of losing a congressional seat and vital federal funding for services that all of us use every day. So I implore everyone listening this evening to please take 10 minutes, complete the census. If you have not already completed that questionnaire, if you care about our community getting its fair share of funding, if we care about our congressional representation and having informed redistricting on a state level, we will take those 10 minutes. If a census taker comes to your door, answer that door. Answer that door. 10 minutes will impact the next 10 years of your life. And we won't get a do-over, we won't get a mulligan. Once the census is completed, tabulated, we will be stuck with those numbers for the next 10 years. So please go to my 2020census.gov or call 1-844-330-2020 and complete the census.
Thank you, Janet. And two other points. One, you mentioned redistricting and reapportionment at the state level, but all those on our call tonight live in local communities throughout the state. So every city council, every county commission district or ward will also go through that process. And so it affects every single community in Georgia for those that are not counted or undercounted. And so it's critical that we do our part in our cities, our counties, our entire state to make sure everyone is counted, because it has a 10-year effect. And also, Janet, I'd like to ask you, we tell our cities all the time that they have skin in this game and it's important they do their part, because for every person not counted, that city or county or our state government still has to serve that individual. They still have the same cost of providing services. They're just not going to get the federal funding to support it. So tell us, what is that dollar figure that the Census Bureau estimates that is lost for each person that's not counted for a decade?
Unfortunately, I cannot provide that information. We don't tabulate that. And usually it is tabulated on a local level and they can make that determination, but I don't have, because it will vary from community to community.
It is a substantial number. Many of our social services, our library systems, schools, there's so much funding that's based on this census count. So I really urge all those who are on the call tonight, the webinar tonight, to go back and be sure your community is doing all that you can. So Janet, thank you for all you and the Census Bureau are doing, and we're going to continue to work with you until the very end.
Okay, I appreciate that. And a simple analogy for that, Larry, if you have 20,000 children to educate and only 10,000 are counted, you will only get federal dollars based on 10,000 children, but you still have to educate 20,000 children.
That's exactly.
Yeah, just that simple example. It should resonate with everyone, how much and how vital. And the other thing, we will need even more federal dollars post-COVID.
All right.
We will need more money.
Well, thank you, Janet. We appreciate you taking your time to be with us Senator Carter, we're going to come back to you now with a few questions. Recently, the Carter Center launched an initiative to strengthen and build confidence in the U.S. election system. Could you share some specifics about this?
I'm not going to put water on.
Hold on, Jason's mic is not on, but I think AJ's was.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Carter Center, as I mentioned before, we've monitored 110 elections, and it's generally been in places where we thought that our involvement was going to be important, either because there had been a significant conflict that had arisen in the country that was being resolved by an election, because there was significant polarization among the different parties, a history of disenfranchisement or marginalization for particular communities, often racial minorities, threats of violence surrounding the election, a host of things that undermined the integrity of the process in a lot of these places. And unfortunately, right now, some of that is present in the United States. I mean, and on both sides, we've seen and heard almost on a daily basis that people are concerned about the integrity of the process. And so we felt it was important for the Carter Center to add its voice to that. I'll say one thing that is evident, including hearing from Secretary Raffensperger and others, and the GMA is well aware of, normally for an election to meet international standards, one of the reasons that the Carter Center has not observed one in the United States is we don't meet the international standard that requires sort of an independent electoral body that would govern an election. And even in Georgia, we essentially have 159 different electoral bodies, plus a host of other things that can be driven in local elections and otherwise. And the Secretary of State has some role, but really it's incredibly divided in terms of how the ballots are presented and other things like that. So that is one of the ways that makes American democracy unique. It makes it very cumbersome. We would call for reform, in different contexts. But when you lay on top of the polarization in our community and sort of the growing sentiment that there's on both sides, that there's issues with respect to the system, we felt like it was important for us to play a role. The second thing I'll say, and then I'll throw it back to you, is our neutrality is also really important in our other election observations in Guyana or Liberia or Myanmar. Nobody questions what side we're on. Of course, we were founded by a Democratic president. I'm the chairman of the board. I got my own political beliefs that are well known to a lot of people, but we have done our very best, and we will continue to do our best to be scrupulously neutral, to partner with folks to make sure that we are seen to be neutral in our discussion. But what I would say our goal is to really separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to election discussions, because we'll sometimes hear about whether an absentee ballot was properly counted, or whether there's a systematic problem or a systemic problem with respect to voter suppression or voter fraud. And those issues, it's really important for leaders, for the press, for people like on this phone call right now or on this webinar right now, to understand that there's a difference between an irregularity, something that happened, something that is a problem that we want to fix, and something that's a real threat to the integrity of an election, something that's going to undermine an election's ability to reflect the will of the people, as we would say at the Carter Center. And so one of the things that we're going to be trying to do is to identify these are issues that, yes, they're problems, but they're not the type of issues that people should be nervous will undermine the integrity of the election. And here's a group of issues that truly are important. And right now, I think we don't have a good arbiter in our public discourse about what kinds of things are going to be that to rise to the level of really being questionable, sort of breaches of democratic norms and things that will otherwise just be, we had some machines break in a particular precinct and we got to deal with that on election day. So I think that's what you'll hear from us over time as this moves forward. And we're looking forward to, despite the United States not being the typical election for the Carter Center, we felt like this moment in our nation's history required us as a human rights organization, as a democracy organization, to get involved and to do what we can with our unique perspective.
Thank you. This next question is not really an integrity issue, but more of an apathy issue. But according to the Pew Research Center, of those who were eligible to vote in 2016 but did not, 25% cited their dislike of the candidates or campaign issues as their main reason for not participating, which was a record high. What would you say to eligible voters who are considering staying home for that reason?
You know, I think that the remarkable piece of apathy, or the remarkable piece of you know, I think one of the things that's interesting to me is the standards to which we hold our political leaders. You know, I think that you have folks that put their names out there that are try to engage people, that will seek people to participate, and folks don't respond, right? I think that one of the things that I would say is that folks who feel like they don't have anyone to go vote for should still show up. And they can show up and they can write somebody in. You can show up and you can say, you know what, I'm going to vote for Larry Hanson instead of whoever else it is that folks have the options. And the reason I think that's important is because if you don't show up, you're truly irrelevant. You know, when people talk about who matters in our discourse, when politicians are called on to make decisions about what they want to do and what it is that they feel are important and who they're responding to, you know, even the poll numbers that Andra was showing before, many of them are of likely voters. And so, you know, those are the folks that drive our discussion. And to stay home does not do a service to your view that you're looking for something better. What it does is it sends a message that you don't care, and that it is. And so I would encourage people, and in fact, I know, you know, one of the stories that is I remember from other elections is, you know, in the old days in the United States, they used to talk about sort of the man and the woman getting in the horse-drawn carriage in 1925 or excuse me, 29 to ride down to the county courthouse and cancel out each other's vote, right? One person votes for one candidate, the other votes for the other, and then they go back home. In Liberia, there was a person who came, you know, took the entire day, walked X number of miles to their voting precinct to go and vote for none of the above, and to write on the ballot, I don't like any of these candidates. And to me, that was such a remarkable testament to democracy, that this person says, I'm going to show up, I'm going to participate in this community, and I'm going to say I'm doing this because I don't approve of what's going on. And that kind of voice actually gets heard in a way that it doesn't if people just stay home.
We talked about Georgia Ford and building an identity and the importance of being a Georgian and why it is important to us. And with your family's history, your grandfather and even yours of public service, can you tell us what it means to you to be a Georgian and what we can do to improve our identity so that we're proud to be Georgians?
Sure. I think, number one, I'm very proud to be a Georgian. I think that, you know, we have a history that is a microcosm of the struggle that our country has undergone and the transformation that our country has undergone in many ways. Georgia is a microcosm for the long-standing fight for freedom, the long-standing fight for equality. Georgia is the cradle of the civil rights movement in all of those ways. And even just talking about voting, you think about the leadership that we've had in this state, from John Lewis to Dr. King to many, many others who have driven this idea that participation, you know, that the nonviolent tool of voting is the most important one that we have, that we can drive this expansion of freedom as we move forward. That to me is the legacy of Georgia. And, you know, my family, frankly, you know, generations ago, you know, was a part of the white power structure that owned slaves and fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. And the story of my family is one that begins there. And that you know, it ends or moves forward with my children, you know, who are so excited to go to Howard Middle School right now because it was Dr. King's school, and they are participating. You know, we go to Ebenezer Baptist Church, and that's our faith community as a family, and we have done that. And my grandfather, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, said he stood on the shoulders of the civil rights leaders that came before him, because without that civil rights movement, you know, my family would still be stuck in these old horrible ways that had to be broken down. And yes, we participated in those ways. And my grandfather announced when he was inaugurated as governor that the time for racial discrimination was over. And he, you know, moved forward and did an enormous amount to break down those barriers. But that common purpose that defines Georgia's history, that defines my family as a white person, that defines, you know, the great multiracial coalitions that we have built to this day, that's who we are, and that's the best story of America. And frankly, that beacon of democracy that the United States is across the world, to where they look to people from Georgia when we show up in Liberia or when we show up in Egypt or Myanmar to observe an election, it's reflected in that Georgia history. So I appreciate the question, and it's meaningful to me.
Well, thank you, Senator, and we certainly appreciate your passion and your participation this evening. Going to close out here quickly with a couple of questions for Professor Gillespie. But Professor Gillespie, how does voting in Georgia, the process, the structure, the citizen participation, compare to voting in the rest of the country?
I mean, there are ways that it is similar and different. So as much as we have different county governments, and I think Senator Carter is absolutely right in thinking about how it's not just 50 different states, but we're talking about the 3,000-ish county governments that have some say over voting. So, you know, there are lots of things that we would look at differently. You know, we always look at big benchmark questions like winter voter registration deadlines. And so those vary from being about a month out, as they are here in Georgia, to being, you know, same day voter registration as you could possibly have in Minnesota. We could look at sort of the presence of early voting. So early voting has become a mainstay in Georgia. There are places like Pennsylvania which don't have it. We could look at different rules for absentee ballots. So there are states that before this year, like Pennsylvania, didn't have no excuses absentee ballot. That was something that we had adopted before. And then there are states that have all mail voting, like Oregon. And then there are states that are now getting used to having to do a lot of their business by mail, like we are. And so all of those factors together are going to differentiate the states, and it's probably going to be somewhat predictive of how fast votes get counted and predict the types of problems that one might actually have. So I think, you know, it's actually too hard to vary, but, you know, the things that we're encountering in Georgia, you know, in some ways, depending on the type of electoral system, are not going to be dissimilar from challenges that other states could be facing if they're using similar types of rules and processes.
Okay, and final question, for those that are concerned about the increasing political polarization and an inability to collaborate with those who are different, what is one concrete step we as individuals can take to address this problem?
Well, you know, I attribute a lot of our political polarization today to what we call in political science ideological sorting. So, and I think we have to sort of, I'm going to preface this by saying, I think we have to keep in mind how extraordinary the mid 20th century, that immediate post-World War II period, was in American history. But one of the things that hallmarked the parties during that period was that they were both big tents and that they were both ideologically very diverse. So your Democratic coalition included conservative Democrats who were, you know, not just conservative fiscally, but they also tended to be conservative on racial issues, which is a problem, and we need to acknowledge that. And the Republican coalition included conservatives, but it also included people who would be considered ideologically liberal today. And so what we have seen happen in the last two generations is, particularly among whites, this is less true among people of color because of issues related to race, we've seen the liberals increasingly become Democrats and the conservatives increasingly become Republicans. And so what that means is that you have less of a moderating force within the parties to try to bring people together, to have people who would be natural bridge builders. So, you know, we could talk about what could we do to make the parties themselves more ideologically heterogeneous, or to give the moderates greater voice within the party. I think probably some concrete steps that we all can do, regardless of our partisan affiliation, is to make conscious decisions to learn not to other people whose political beliefs are different from ours. If we look at public opinion data, it's not just that people have principled disagreements with members of the opposite party. People actually believe that that people of the opposite party are actually dangerous. And when you can call people dangerous, when you can other people, that's going to make you oppose them more vociferously. There's public opinion data that would suggest that people would flip out more about their child marrying somebody of a different political party than thankfully they would because of their child marrying somebody of a different race. And so while we can applaud sort of the increasing racial tolerance, we have to sort of, get a hold of this increasing partisan intolerance. So I know how difficult it is, but we all have to take steps to make sure that we get to know people and that we don't stereotype and defame people whose political beliefs are different from ours. And then, particularly for people who are living in safe districts. And I won't get into sort of the partisan gerrymandering argument because we could talk about sort of like what the data shows on that. Although I will say from a normative standpoint, there should be no normative reason why people should be opposed to nonpartisan districting just on principle. If we just take the districts as they are, I think sometimes we have to be mindful of sort of how we're participating in primaries and whether or not we are nominating extremists. And so if you see your member of your legislator, whatever level we're talking about, behaving in an extremist fashion, then perhaps you need to send a signal to them to modify their behavior or indicate that you would be willing to vote against them in a primary or in a general election. Unfortunately, we're too wedded to our parties sometimes to penalize people who behave badly if they have the right letter behind their name, and we can't possibly stomach somebody of the other party voting that way. But sooner or later, we're going to have to start penalizing people for bad behavior by not encouraging it, by continuing to vote for them because they see that as a mandate to continue doing what they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. And as we close, I want to take an opportunity to recognize a couple of folks. These things don't happen, and there's a lot of work goes on behind the scenes. So Wilma Southern with Central Atlanta Progress, and also Brenda Belcher with Georgia Ford. We appreciate all the work you've done to plan this. And AJ Robinson, I want to thank you too for your support and efforts. And in closing, I just want to share with everyone that we should take these comments tonight seriously, be motivated and energized by those, and make sure that we exercise our right to vote. The purpose of having this is so that we can make sure that our voices are heard, and our election is the opportunity to do that. So we look forward to engaging with you again in the future. Thank you for joining the call tonight, and make sure we all go out and vote and make sure we're counted. So thank you and have a good evening.